Anybody who cares enough to stand behind a podium and talk about it certainly has a strong point of view, or else they wouldn't bother. And I have to admit that my point of view is decidedly not balanced. So in my remarks to them, I told them that I was much older. I'm 51, and there's no question in my mind that there will be peace in my lifetime, and much, and a lot before that. But I think that has to do partly with our personality. I'm an optimistic person, but also at the knowledge that we have at our disposal. And I think educating ourselves about this topic is crucial. And I think, if I didn't have hope, if I didn't think this was going to clear, if I wasn't clear that this is going to lead to a very specific objective, a very specific goal, I wouldn't be doing this. And I think if we are active in this issue, it's important that we clarify what the goal is, what the end result is, what is it that we're trying to accomplish, and what does peace look like? We were chatting earlier with the senator, and he mentioned there are far more difficult problems in the world that have been solved already. And so I don't see why we can't tackle this one and solve it for the benefit of everyone. Part of the problem is, of course, that there's so much misinformation, so many myths have been created around this issue, so much double standard. One myth is, of course, that this conflict has been going on for centuries and centuries, and that place has been plagued by war forever, and those people over there have been killing each other for so long that there's really no hope. Well, I can say that those people over there have not been killing each other for that long. The issue is a political issue, and it has a very clear resolution. But that is out there, and that is often why people don't take the time to try to figure it out. Another problem is, the double standard that exists. And I'll give you one example. Zionism. Zionism is the ideology that created the state of Israel. And what is Zionism? It's the idea that Jewish people everywhere, because they are somehow perhaps the descendants of the ancient Hebrews who lived on that land some 2,000 or 3,000 years ago, have a right, are you ready for this? To return. In other words, even though there's not a single Jewish person alive today that can trace their family roots back to the ancient Hebrews, the term that the Zionists used was to return. And of course you have to wonder how they were able to sell this absurd idea. And not only how they were able to sell it, but how successful they were. Today, when you talk to people, it's absolutely clear that Jewish people have the right to return to their ancient homeland. As though, all of us that are Jewish, we were there just, it was only 2,000 years ago, and now we're going back. And this is perfectly accepted. On the other hand, when we talk about the right of return of Palestinians, now that is a completely different issue. Palestinians have to forget, because when they were displaced 65 years ago, that was a very long time ago, the past is behind us. And we really can't discuss this, we won't negotiate on that particular issue. So there we have it. And this is the discourse that exists today. In other words, this is not something I'm making up. This is exactly how the discourse on Israel-Palestine is taking place. You have these outrageous ideas that people have accepted to be true. You have this outrageous double standard that is out there that people are perfectly willing to live with. And this is how we move forward. So there's no wonder, of course, that a solution has not been found yet. Now, when we talk about the issue of Palestine, then there's always a lot of bad news. It's very tragic, it's very sad, it's very complicated. But I want to begin with something, with a bit of good news. Can I see a show of hands of anybody who saw the movie 5 Broken Cameras? Okay, that's not enough. Everybody should see 5 Broken Cameras. And as you may have heard, 5 Broken Cameras was nominated for an Academy Award. Sadly, they didn't win, but this picture is Ahmad Burnat, who is the creator of the movie, at the Academy Awards with his wife and his son. And I think this is a wonderful moment. I think it's a salute to the movie, but beyond that, it's a salute to the Palestinian struggle. It's a salute to Emad and his family. It's a salute to Bil'in and to Nabi Saleh and Eileen and all the other wonderful places in Palestine that courageously, every single week, step up and face the Israeli forces, face the tremendous amount of violence by the Israeli forces, face the arrests and the tortures and the beatings, and every single week they show up to protest. And they are determined, they are principled, they are relentless in their pursuit of justice, and they're just as relentless in their determination not to respond with violence. And although this is Emad and his family, I'm sure everybody in Palestine, everybody who participates, all the leaders of the popular resistance, and I think indeed every Palestinian should feel a great sense of pride having seen them and having seen this picture. So I think this was a great moment, and I wanted to begin today with this picture. Now, one of the things that I learned as an Israeli, and it hurt me deeply, personally, was that the Palestinians called the war of 1948 a catastrophe. They called the independence that we, the Jews, finally were able to achieve after 2,000 years in exile, a catastrophe. That war, that momentous war, that accomplishment of the independence of the State of Israel, which is so much a part of the identity of Israelis and the identity of Jewish people who identify with Zionism, they call it a catastrophe. And this, like I said, it offended me personally because so much of my family was a part of the establishment of the State of Israel. The State of Israel for me was like my extended family. Cabinet ministers and judges, and my father's a general, and all kinds of people who served and established the State of Israel. But having known Palestinians and having been engaged and in this journey into Palestine over the years, I came to understand what the Nakba means, what the catastrophe means. Last month, I saw it. And I've been to refugee camps, and I've been all over the West Bank, and I've been to many places, but last month, I saw it. And I saw it in two places. This picture is from the refugee camp, the Gaza refugee camp, which is in Jordan, in northern Jordan, by Jarash, by the city of Jarash. To see the poverty, to see close to 40,000 people living without running water, without sewage, elderly people who can't afford matches to light the wood to make tea. And this is maybe an hour and a half drive from Haifa, 2 hours drive from Tel Aviv. This is inexcusable. It's unjustifiable. It's inexplicable. That these children and these families would have to live like this only because they're Palestinians. And only because the world accepted this absurd notion that I alluded to earlier, that every Jew in the world has a right to go and live in Palestine, but Palestinians do not have a right to return. This is the Nakba, the fact that it exists today. It's not something that happened 65 years ago. It's something that began 65 years ago, and the worst of it is that it still exists today. I would argue that a good time to start discussing this issue, a good time in history, to start discussing this issue is precisely the 29th of November 1947, which is when the United Nations came up with this map. This is the partition map, or the partition resolution. Now, if you knew nothing about this issue and you took a look at this map, you'd have to wonder, how does anybody go on the ground actually and delineate the borders? How do you go on actually, how do you go through that country and how do you put this together? But beyond that, the United Nations, when they created this, or when they accepted this resolution and when they created this map, they decided that it was wise to give the larger portion of the land, the larger portion of Palestine, to a small community of Jewish immigrants that numbered less than 500,000 people, of which my grandparents and parents were a part. Immigrants, and they had children, so the children of immigrants. And the smaller portion to the nearly 1.5 million Palestinian natives of the land. And somehow somebody expected that this would work. And to this day, we hear people arguing that this is all the Palestinians' fault. In other words, the fact that the conflict is still going on is the Palestinians' fault, because they didn't accept this. Is there anybody that would have accepted this? Would anybody accept such an absurd notion that the United Nations would slice off the larger portion of your own country, of your own homeland, and give it to a small group of immigrants? And I don't believe anybody expected this would work, and of course it didn't work. It didn't last a single day. And of course, at that point, the two stories diverge. You've got the story that Israel tells, the story that I grew up with, the story that Americans or people in the West grew up with, which says that the Arabs did not accept this resolution, and they began a massive attack against the Jewish community in an attempt to destroy them and kill them, just like the Nazis did only several years before that. And miraculously, heroically, the Jewish community was able to prevail, but not only to prevail, to conquer the land, and the state of Israel was established, and once again Jewish people had independence in their ancient homeland after 2,000 years. I mean, this is almost biblical. And when you grow up with it, you feel a sense of pride. This is a wonderful story to grow up with. And then we look at the details. When we take a look at the details, when we take a look at the two communities that existed in Palestine at that time, both the Jewish community, or I should call it the Zionist community, and the Palestinian community were expecting to become states. They already had the institutions of state. But there was one thing that the Zionist Jewish community invested in heavily, and that's a military force. It's a militia. The Zionist militia at that time already numbered close to 40,000 armed, well-trained, and very well indoctrinated men. My father was an officer in that militia. There was no equivalent on the Palestinian side. There was no Palestinian military force. So who are these Arabs that attacked? Who are the Arabs that attacked? We know the other Arab countries tried to intervene, not very successfully, but that wasn't until 7-8 months later. So who are the Arabs that attacked? And what did they attack with? Well, they didn't attack. It's not true. As soon as this resolution was accepted, the Zionist forces began a massive campaign of ethnic cleansing and terrorizing that lasted for 12 months. And that is how the Jewish state, or the state of Israel, was established. It was a massive campaign of terrorism that lasted 12 months, at the end of which close to 1 million Palestinians were forced out of their homes. Hundreds of towns and villages, some of these towns with a history of over 1,000 years, destroyed, including churches and mosques and schools, and of course homes. And the Zionist forces managed to conquer close to 80% of the country. And immediately began a campaign of building cities and towns and farms and so on for Israeli Jews only, on Palestinian land. Now it makes sense. Now we understand how this happened. There's no miracle here. This was a well-planned, well-thought-out campaign of conquest and ethnic cleansing for the purpose of building this idea of the state of Israel, which I would argue is not a Jewish state, but a state that favors Jews. There's really nothing Jewish about Zionism. Now, one of the things that I did in the book is I combined just the general history of the country with my personal story or my family's story. Because the story that Israelis learn and the stories that people learn in the West is the Arabs attacked. We won and they left. We asked them to stay, but they left. This is the story. So why wouldn't we take their homes? There's no moral question here. There's no problem. But she was presenting a moral issue. She was presenting a moral dilemma. For her, it wasn't a dilemma. For her, it was very clear, but she was presenting a moral dilemma. And beyond the fact that she was presenting a moral dilemma, she was talking about something that we, the Israelis, did wrong to the Palestinians, and she doesn't excuse it. She doesn't justify it. She never did. In the narrative, in the Israeli narrative, even when we admit that we did something wrong, if we talk about the massacre of Deir Yassin, for example, this is taught in Israeli schools. But at the end of the story of the massacre, which everybody agrees was unfortunate, There was a quote from Chaim Weizmann, who was a famous Zionist leader, that says, "But thankfully, because of this massacre, hundreds of thousands of Arabs left, and we were able to create a Jewish majority." In other words, we did something wrong, but it turned out to be fine. This is how Israelis describe or justify everything they do, if they are willing to admit that they did something wrong. She wasn't justifying it. She just told me the story. And it was wrong, and that was it. And treating Palestinians in this way, even though it's a story, is rare. Very, very rare. Now, between 1948 and 1967, this was the map of Israel. It was almost the entire country of the entire Palestine became Israel, with the exception of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. In the late spring and early summer of 1967, the drums of war were beating. President Nasser of Egypt entered his forces into the Sinai Peninsula, threatened to close the Straits of Tiran, and the Israeli top command decided this was a cause for war. By then, my father was a general. In fact, all the young officers of 1948 who remained in the military were by then the generals. And they saw this as another opportunity to begin a war and a decisive war. This would have been the third time that Israel would destroy the Egyptian army in those years. And the Israeli cabinet hesitated. There was a tug of war going on between these two centers of power, but of course the military, like it always does in Israel, won the day. And a preemptive strike against Egypt was authorized by the Israeli cabinet. That was very easy. Within a number of days, the Israeli army destroyed the Egyptian army. And then they decided, since the momentum was already there, they wanted more. So then they decided to take the West Bank, which was an area that they'd wanted for many, many years. In terms of their point of view, the Israeli military point of view, taking the West Bank was finishing the job of 48. The fact that the West Bank wasn't included as a part of Israel in 48 was a mistake from their perspective, and they remedied it in 1967. And of course, the Golan Heights was an area that Israel had wanted for many, many years. Now, the story that we hear about this war is, again, the same narrative. It's the exact same theme. The small Jewish state was once again threatened by Arab armies wanting to attack and destroy it. There was an existential threat. And because Israel decided to proceed with the preemptive strike, and because the Israeli military was smarter and more prepared, and of course because we are the children of David who beat Goliath and so on and so forth, it was obvious that we defeated them in 6 days. Even though they were attacking us, and even though they were stronger and bigger, within 6 days we were able to defeat them. This is the narrative, this is the story. Now, as I was preparing for my book, as I was working on the book, I was able to go into Israeli Army archives to learn about my father's career, a very interesting career. And particularly, I was interested in seeing the minutes of the meetings of the generals leading up to the 1967 war. Those minutes have been read by many people, many books have been written about them, because these were very interesting times, crucial times. So I really wasn't expecting to see anything new, because so many people have written about this. But as I was reading the minutes of these meetings, I saw something that my father says, and then some of the other generals repeat, and that is that, in fact, the Egyptian army is not prepared for war. There is no threat. The Egyptian army needed at least 1.5 to 2 years before it's fully prepared for war. Therefore, we now have an opportunity, because they're advancing an ill-prepared army. We have an opportunity to destroy them now, once again. Not a single word about a threat until later on, when they're trying to apply pressure on the cabinet, so they're saying there is a threat. But among themselves, it was absolutely clear that there was no threat, but talk of an opportunity. An opportunity to once again assert Israeli power. This is the general, this is my father. As you know, the book is titled The General's Son, and then The Journey of an Israeli in Palestine. Now it makes sense. Within 6 days it was all over, because the Israeli army was well prepared, well trained. The Arab armies were in shambles. If the Egyptian army wasn't prepared, certainly the Jordanian and Syrian armies were no match for the Israeli military. And within 6 days, they were able to conquer the Sinai Peninsula, take the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. They killed 15,000 Arab soldiers at a loss of 700 Israeli soldiers. Of course, all of us know, especially if we have children, that every son that dies, that is killed, it breaks your heart. At the same time, the difference between 15,000 and 700 has to mean something. Now, as the war was ending, before the war was even over, on the 5th day of the war lasted 6 days. At the very first meeting of the High Command, the Israeli Military High Command, my father stood up and he said, now we have an opportunity to solve the Palestinian problem. And the way to do this is to allow the Palestinians to establish their own state in the West Bank and Gaza. And he had intelligence reports that were confirming that the local leadership was willing to discuss this. He said, for the first time, we are face to face with the Palestinians, who are our neighbors, who could be our natural allies. We can allow them to establish their own state, we can make peace with that state, and this will allow us to make peace with the other Arab countries. As he was saying this, the state of Israel began a massive campaign of ethnic cleansing, forcing hundreds of thousands of Palestinians out of their homes and off their land in the West Bank, destroying cities and towns and homes and so forth, and beginning a massive campaign of building for Israeli Jews only in the West Bank, just like they did after 1948 in the rest of Palestine. They finished the job, and they were going to do exactly what they were going to do, what they had planned to do. And at that point, my father diverged from the rest of Israeli establishment, and for the rest of his life, he worked to that end of recognizing the Palestinian right to self-determination in the West Bank and Gaza, and the right of Palestinians to have equal rights for those Palestinians who remained in Israel and became Israeli citizens. Sadly, on both of those fronts, he failed, because both of those things had not happened. In essence, this is what happened in 1967. Palestine was crossed completely off the map. Israel took over the entire country, and that was it. The conquest was complete. The ethnic cleansing was not complete. It's still going on to this day, but the big parts of it were done. And then a process of de-Arabizing had to take place, and that again is taking place to this day. Because Palestine was an Arab country for 1,500 years until Israel destroyed it. So you have Arab names, you have Arab monuments, you have an Arab culture, and all of this has to be destroyed in order to create this absurd connection between today's Israel and the ancient Hebrews of King David. Now this is happening every day to this day. It's an ongoing process. And one example that I was bringing up is in a place called Silwan, which is just outside the old city of Jerusalem. If you've been to the old city, if you've been to where the Wailing Wall is, as you go out the gate, you go down the hill, there's a huge community of 50,000 people. It's called Silwan. It's down in the valley. But someone decided that the ancient city of David exists under the homes of the people in Silwan. So a community of 50,000 is being destroyed. Their homes are being confiscated, destroyed. People are being kicked out of their homes, forced into exile. The digging has been going on for some time. There's already a park, and you see that the tour buses are already there with tourists, gullible enough to believe this. You see great big placards leading up and showing these beautiful posters of white Israeli children playing with archaeological artifacts. Some of the homes in the periphery are being destroyed because the digging is destroying the structures of the home, the foundations of the homes, and Israeli settlers are taking over in other parts of the community. In other words, a community of 50,000 people is being destroyed every day to this day, in broad daylight, on our watch, and nothing is being said and nothing is being done. It's ethnic cleansing, it's destruction, it's de-Arabizing, all in one, right next to Jerusalem. This is the process that takes place. So today, when people come up and suggest that there could be a possibility that the state of Israel will allow the Palestinians to establish a state, it is absolutely absurd. It would be funny if it wasn't so sad. It demonstrates a complete misreading of Zionism, a complete misreading of what the state of Israel is all about, a complete misreading of the mission of Zionism and the state of Israel. Because the mission is conquering the entire land of Israel, which is entire Palestine, and giving it back to the Jewish people. When they said a land without a people to a people without a land, they didn't mean that there were no people on the land. They meant these were the wrong people. These were people that don't count, so we can get rid of them and bring Jews from around the world. Something they were not very successful in doing, but I'll talk about that later. But this is an absurd proposition. To assume that Israel will somehow allow the Palestinians to establish a state in somewhere on the land of Israel, and this one state that Israel has in fact created is a complete misunderstanding of the reality. And suddenly, in 1993, Israel decided to negotiate with the PLO. Suddenly, September of 1993, we hear there's an Oslo Accord. Rabin and Arafat are on the White House lawn with Bill Clinton, and they're signing this Oslo Accord. What happened? Some of us were naive enough to really believe that this was the beginning of the end. The reality is that by 1993, the conquest of the West Bank had been made permanent. The West Bank was completely integrated with the rest of Israel, and there was no possibility of the creation of a Palestinian state. That is when they were willing to negotiate. Because it wasn't to negotiate for a peace based on a two-state solution, it was to bring the Palestinians on their knees and force Arafat to sign a surrender. That's what Oslo was. And that's why Oslo did not work. My father passed away in 1995, which was the height of the Oslo process. And in an interview he gave to an Israeli paper, just a few months before he died, the headline was, Mati PELED says, Rabin does not want peace. In 1995, at the end of 94, to say Rabin does not want peace means you lost your mind. But he didn't lose his mind. He read the Oslo Accords. And he saw how Israel embarrasses Arafat, embarrasses the Palestinians, and ignores all the benchmarks that they promised that they would fulfill within the agreement. By 1993, the conquest was complete. The West Bank had been completely integrated. There was not a chance anymore for a Palestinian state to be established, and they wanted to bring Arafat to sign or to bring the Palestinian leadership to sign a surrender. In the year 2000, you may remember, Bill Clinton brought Arafat and then the new Prime Minister, Barak, to Camp David to try to close the deal. And after days and days of negotiating, they came out, and what did Bill Clinton say? He said, well, the Palestinians gave some, but the Israelis gave more. In other words, he was blaming the Palestinians for the failure, and what he was saying was the Palestinians did not make concessions. By agreeing to the two-state solutions, the Palestinians gave up 80% of their homeland and the right of the refugees to ever return to their homeland. They did not make concessions, but they wouldn't go beyond that. For 30 years, Arafat was the most consistent voice for peace in the Middle East. He agreed to give up the right of return. He agreed to give up the dream of a Palestinian state in all Palestine. And he agreed to establish a Palestinian state next to Israel, to recognize Israel, the state that destroyed Palestine and forced his people to become refugees, for peace, for the sake of peace. But that was not good enough. They wanted to bring him on his knees, and force him to sign a surrender. And to that, he refused. And for that, he was vilified. And because of that, he had to die in his office with Israeli tanks surrounding him in Ramallah. Israel had never had any intention of allowing a Palestinian state to emerge. And the Palestinians, at least under the leadership of Yasser Arafat, refused to surrender. Now the issue is, of course, that this is all, it sounds like politics, but there's a price that has to be paid, and the price is always paid by innocence. In my personal case, this is my sister's little girl, Smadar. She was 13 years old when she was killed in a suicide attack in Jerusalem. This was September 4th, 1997. Now, how do you wrap your head around something like this? To this day, I don't know. This is not something that you can explain. This is not something that you can write about. It's beyond that. I was already living here in the United States. I took the first plane home. And this was big news in Israel because this is the granddaughter of General PELED, number one. But not only was he a general, he was also Mr. Peace of Palestine. And look what they did to his granddaughter. He had already passed away by then. And when I reached my sister's apartment, it was filled with reporters from everywhere. And when my sister finally came out to talk to people and so forth, she was asked, of course, who's responsible, and what about retaliation, and what about revenge, and so on. And her response was, No real mother would want to see this happen to any other mother. The notion of killing people in response to the killing of people is absolutely absurd, and to her, motherhood was how you symbolize that. Now, as far as who was responsible, she said, these two young men were brought to such a level of despair and hopelessness that they were willing to take their own lives and take the lives of other innocent civilians, including my daughter. But it was the brutal oppression and occupation that we, the Israelis, have placed upon those people that brought them to that. Because when you take away people's land, and you destroy their homes, and you throw their fathers in jail, and you shoot their younger brothers and sisters in their schools, and you take away their water, and you take away their ability to live, this is the price that we pay. And she said, I hold the Israeli government directly responsible for my daughter's death. So now we had this Israeli bereaved mother turning everything upside down. Because what do we know to be true? We know the Palestinians are terrorists, the Israelis are victims. Israel wants peace, the Palestinians are not willing to make concessions. And here's this Israeli mother who's saying everything is upside down. And from that day, she became very active. I became very active. Her husband, Rami, became very active on this issue, on the issue of reconciliation and ending the conflict, based on recognizing the issue of the conflict, the problem, which is the oppression and the occupation. I became very interesting to see other Israelis come through these meetings and leave, unable to sit there. And they would say to me, how do you sit with these extremists? And I said, what extremists? They're here for the same reason I'm here. We're all here to try to figure this out. But the sitting with Palestinians as an equal was something that these Israelis could not stand. Now, what is it that makes us think that it's so dangerous over there? Well, if you've crossed any of the checkpoints, you've seen the sign. And this particular sign is from Colombia. And as you can see by the colors, it's a warning sign. And what it says is this. It says that this road leads to Area A, and it's prohibited in Israelis, and which is under Palestinian control. And Israelis are prohibited from entering Area A because it's life-threatening and it's a felony. 2 exclamation marks. Not 1, but 2, because it's a threat of losing your life, and being a felon didn't scare you enough. Certainly the 2 exclamation marks would make you turn around. And every time you try to cross from one side to the other, you see this sign. So if you have any sense at all, you turn back. Thankfully, I don't have that kind of sense. And I know many others who don't. And I've crossed many, many times. And every time I cross, and you've done this, I'm sure many of you have done this, you've seen the exact same thing. What do we see when we cross the Palestinian side? Well, the most common sight is kids going to school. Because they usually have 2 shifts of the school day. So there's always kids going back and from to and from school in their little uniforms and backpacks. And then there's traffic jams in stores and markets and people and so on. I've yet to see the threat. I've been doing this for a very long time, over a decade. I've yet to see the threat. I have not seen one single Palestinian waiting for me on the other side, wanting to kill me, including going under the ground, being smuggled through the tunnel into Gaza. And as of course you know, the devil lives in Gaza, Hamas. I have not seen it. To this day, I have not seen the threat. And over the years, I came to realize this has nothing to do with security, this has nothing to do with safety, this has nothing to do with a threat. It's an attempt to always keep one side frustrated and one side afraid. That's why there's a wall, that's why you see these soldiers armed to the teeth, that's why Palestinians are terrorized at checkpoints for hours and hours, that's why Palestinians who go through Tel Aviv airport are terrorized for hours and hours, humiliated, interrogated, cavity searches and strip searches, the people who have never been even in a protest in their life, just because they're Palestinians. Because this is not their place. And Israel will do everything in its power to make sure Palestinians see that this is not for them, this is not their place. I end my book with a question, where do we go from here? Or rather, with not a question, but an answer about where do we go from here, or my answer at least. The reality is that Israel created one state, one Jewish state, the state of Israel on the entire country, on the entire land of Palestine, or the land of Israel. But still we have, what's about 6.5 million Israelis and close to 6 million Palestinians living there, under different sets of laws. Because this is a Jewish state, or it's a state that prefers Jews, Israeli Jews like myself have all the rights. It's a complete democracy for us. We can say what we want, we can write what we want, we can come and go as we please, and so on. Palestinians who are Israeli citizens are afforded some rights, but there are close to 30 laws in the law books that discriminate against them specifically. And people always say, look at Israel, it's such a wonderful democracy, it's got, Arab citizens. And in fact, they like it there so much they don't even want to leave. Of course, this is their land, right? The situation in some of the Palestinian communities within Israel is so disgraceful. It's oftentimes worse than it is in Gaza. You'd be hard-pressed to find a single permit ever given or a single dollar ever invested in Palestinian communities within Israel. At the same time, Israeli towns and cities and villages and malls and so forth are being built for Israeli Jews only. And then you've got the Palestinians in the West Bank who have no rights at all, who live under the gun, who live at the mercy, I should say, of the Israeli military, which I think is really today no more than a glorified terrorist organization. Of course, they have uniforms, and they have commanders, and they've got fancy weapons, but they're nothing more than a glorified terrorist organization, because terrorizing is what they do. Terrorizing an entire nation is what the Israeli army does. Whether it's bombing Gaza, knowing full well they're going to kill civilians as a matter of policy. Killing civilians in Gaza, for example, is not a mistake, it's a policy. How else would you explain dropping hundreds of tons of bombs on one of the most densely populated areas in the world? Facing off demonstrators, peaceful demonstrators in the West Bank with live ammunition, with hundreds of armed soldiers, beating, arresting, keeping thousands of political prisoners in its jails. This is the price of having a Jewish state in Palestine. You have the laws for Israeli Jews, you've got certain laws for Palestinians here, you've got different laws for Palestinians there. And here we are, and the discourse is, when people do talk about it, they say, well, Israel is such a wonderful democracy. It's a democracy for me, granted, but that's it. So the question is, where do we go from here? What could be normal, more natural than to take this one state that's been established and turn it into a democracy? There is no place anymore, anywhere in that country, that you can delineate and say, well, this will be a Palestinian state, and this will be the state of the Israeli state. There's no place like that. Israel is taking care of that. A system of highways, industry, billions invested in housing and communities for Israeli Jews only. Shopping malls for Israeli Jews only. Have been built in a way that they're not going anywhere. The West Bank has been completely become a part of the state of Israel. When you look at weather maps, government maps, textbook, geography maps and textbooks, any official map of the state of Israel, this is the map. And you'd be hard-pressed to find any mention of Palestinian cities. It's only Israeli cities, including the Israeli cities in the West Bank, of course. Just like apartheid was treated as a regime that had to be taken down, just like other brutal dictatorships and non-democracies had to be treated as something that has to be transformed into a democracy, the state of Israel has to be treated the exact same way. It is a brutal, racist regime that has to be replaced by a democracy. And it is. It's not only possible, it's not only realistic, but it's inevitable. It's not only morally the right thing to do, it's not only the only way we can ever find justice, but it's also inevitable. 6.5 million Israelis cannot control 6 million Palestinians forever. You have two societies that are very similar, high education levels, an ability to get to work the next day. If the walls came down tomorrow, people in Gaza would be able to function just like any other place in the world. A perfectly functioning democracy. But you need to allow people freedom. We need to give people an opportunity to live together and actually function as a state. But the only way this would work is with equal rights. Then they can tap into the potential as societies, they can tap into the potential. Many of you have been to that country, you know how beautiful it is, you know how much it has in store, how much promise it has. But this will only happen once we all put our minds together, put our efforts together to bring about a real democracy. Thank you very much.